October 5th, 6:47. Temperature 52 F. Overcast with intermittent drizzle. The fluorescent lights above Clearwater Community Pool flickered like dying stars against the darkening October sky. Outside, the first hints of winter pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the chlorine-scented air. The building groaned under the weight of 30 years of Pacific Northwest weather, its aging infrastructure a testament to better times when the community had money to spend on more than just keeping the lights on. 16-year-old Dante Cornelius adjusted his goggles one final time, the rubber strap catching slightly on his dark, unruly hair. His lean frame cut through the artificial lighting as he stretched beside Lane 4, his muscles taut with the anticipation that came before every practice. The regional championships were 3 weeks away, and Coach Morrison had been pushing the team harder than ever. For Dante, this wasn't just about winning, it was about escape. The scholarship to UCLA wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a lifeline out of Riverside, away from his father's alcohol-soaked rages and his mother's defeated silence. Every stroke through the water brought him closer to freedom. Every second shaved off his time was another step toward a future that didn't include trailer parks and broken promises. Cornelius! Coach Morrison's voice echoed off the tile walls, sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise of splashing water and teenage chatter. You are up in Lane 4. I want to see that 200 freestyle time drop below 1:48 today, or you will be doing extra laps until midnight. Morrison was a man carved from disappointment and chlorine. His own Olympic dreams had died in the pool 30 years ago, and now he channeled that frustrated ambition into molding teenage swimmers who might achieve what he never could. His weathered face bore the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades staring at stopwatches, counting seconds that meant everything to his athletes and nothing to the world beyond these walls. Dante nodded, feeling the familiar pre-race flutter in his stomach. Around him, the other members of the Riverside Riptides went through their warm-up routines. There was Cassandra Voss, the team captain, whose perfect technique masked a perfectionism that bordered on obsession. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a regulation cap, but a few rebellious strands escaped to frame her angular face. She'd been swimming competitively since she was 7, and the pressure from her surgeon father had turned what started as childhood fun into a relentless pursuit of validation. In Lane 2, Marcus Rothwell executed his pre-race ritual with the precision of a monk performing morning prayers. Dive, 4 strokes, turn, 4 strokes back. The same pattern he'd followed for 3 years, ever since he'd joined the team as a way to channel the anger that had been eating him alive since his parents' divorce. His broad shoulders and powerful build made him a natural sprinter, but it was his methodical approach to training that had caught the attention of college scouts. 10 minutes until time trials. Morrison's voice cut through the facility again. I want everyone focused. State championships are breathing down our necks, and half of you are swimming like you are afraid of the water. The assistant coaches, Jennifer Walsh and Tom Hartley, moved between the lanes, checking technique and offering last-minute advice. Walsh, barely 25 and fresh out of college herself, still believed in the transformative power of sport. She saw potential in every stroke, hope in every improvement. Hartley, older and more cynical, had learned to spot which kids would make it and which would flame out before graduation. As the team prepared for the evening's time trials, none of them noticed the figure watching from the observation deck above. The elevated viewing area was supposed to be locked after 6 p.m., but the security at Clearwater Pool had never been particularly tight. The watcher remained perfectly still, positioned behind one of the structural pillars that supported the aging roof. Dante slipped into the water, the familiar embrace of chlorinated warmth enveloping his body. This was where he felt most at home, where the chaos of his life outside these walls couldn't touch him. In the water, there was only the rhythm of his breathing, the pull of his arms, and the endless black line painted on the pool bottom that guided him toward his future. Swimmers, take your mark. The pool fell silent except for the gentle lapping of water against the lane lines. Dante crouched into his starting position, every muscle coiled and ready. In this moment, suspended between preparation and action, he felt invincible. The starting signal echoed through the facility like a gunshot. Dante launched himself into the water with the grace of a natural athlete, his body cutting through the surface with minimal splash. His stroke was fluid, economical, each movement designed for maximum efficiency. This was what 3 years of Morrison's brutal training had built, a swimming machine capable of turning teenage desperation into collegiate opportunity. Beside him, Cassandra matched his pace stroke for stroke, her technique textbook perfect but lacking the raw hunger that drove Dante forward. In lane 2, Marcus powered through the water with brute force, his sprinter's build giving him an early advantage that would fade as the distance increased. Morrison walked along the pool deck, his stopwatch catching the harsh fluorescent light. Looking good, Cornelius. Stay with that rhythm. As Dante approached the 100-meter mark, he could feel the familiar burn beginning in his shoulders and lungs. This was where champions were made or broken, in the space between comfort and collapse, where only will and preparation could carry you forward. The watcher in the observation deck leaned forward slightly, attention focused entirely on lane 4. Dante touched the wall for his turn, his flip executed with the precision of thousands of repetitions. As he pushed off the wall and began the third length of his 200-meter trial, something felt different. The water seemed heavier somehow, more resistant to his stroke. He attributed it to fatigue and pushed harder, drawing on reserves of determination that had carried him through countless difficult moments. But as he reached the 50-meter mark, the sensation intensified. The pool lights seemed dimmer, the familiar sounds of the facility muffled as if he was swimming through cotton rather than water. His stroke rhythm faltered for just a moment, but it was enough to break the hypnotic focus that had carried him through the first 3/4 of his race. "Come on, Dante." Cassandra's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she was swimming in the lane right beside him. "Don't fade on me now." Dante tried to respond, to find that extra gear that had won him regional medals, but his body felt disconnected from his will. The black line on the pool bottom wavered in his vision, and for a terrifying moment he wondered if he was experiencing some kind of medical emergency. The final 50 meters became a battle between his mind and his rebellious body. Each stroke required conscious effort. Each breath felt insufficient. The wall ahead seemed to be moving away from him rather than getting closer, like some cruel optical illusion designed to break his spirit. Morrison's voice cut through the water. "What's happening in lane 4? Cornelius looks like he's dying out there." With a final surge of will, Dante reached for the wall, his fingers grazing the touchpad with barely enough force to register his time. He surfaced, gasping for air that seemed thin and unsatisfying. 2103, 103, and 7, Morrison announced, disappointment heavy in his voice. "That's 15 seconds slower than your personal best, Cornelius." What the hell was that? Dante clung to the pool edge, his vision swimming with more than just chlorine irritation. The other swimmers had finished their races and were looking at him with expressions ranging from concern to confusion. This wasn't the Dante Cornelius they knew, the steady, reliable swimmer who could be counted on to deliver when it mattered. "I don't know, coach," Dante managed between ragged breaths. Something felt wrong. The water felt different. The water felt different. Morrison's tone mixed skepticism with growing concern. "Are you feeling sick, dizzy?" Before Dante could answer, the lights in the facility flickered again, this time staying dim for several long seconds before returning to full brightness. In that moment of semi-darkness, several swimmers later swore they saw something move in the water, a shadow that didn't belong to any of them, gliding just beneath the surface of the adjacent lane. "Probably just the electrical system acting up again," Assistant Coach Walsh said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "This place is falling apart." Dante pulled himself out of the pool, his legs unsteady beneath him. The familiar routine of post-workout stretching and shower preparations felt foreign, as if he were watching someone else go through the motions. The other swimmers gave him space, sensing that something fundamental had shifted, but not understanding what. As the team began to pack up their equipment, Morrison approached Dante with the expression of a man who had seen too many young athletes hit the wall of their limitations. "Look, son," Morrison said, his voice softer than usual. "Sometimes your body just isn't ready for what your mind wants to do. It happens to every swimmer eventually. The question is whether you let it break you or use it to come back stronger." Dante nodded, but his attention was drawn to the observation deck above. For just a moment he could have sworn he saw a figure moving in the shadows up there. But when he looked directly at the spot, there was nothing but empty space and the geometric patterns cast by the support beams. "Coach," Dante said, "is that observation deck supposed to be locked after hours?" Morrison followed his gaze upward. "Yeah, it should be." "Why?" "I thought I saw someone up there." Morrison squinted at the darkened upper level. "Probably just shadows playing tricks on your eyes. That happens when you are exhausted." But he made a mental note to check with building security about the upper deck access. As the team finished their post-practice routine, the atmosphere in the facility had subtly shifted. What had started as a normal training session now felt charged with an undercurrent of unease that none of them could quite identify or articulate. Cassandra was the first to notice that something was off with the pool itself. "Coach," she called out, pointing to the water. "Look at lane 4. Everyone turned to see what had caught her attention. The water in Dante's lane appeared to be moving differently than in the other lanes, creating small eddies and currents that defied the typical post-practice stillness. It was as if something large had recently disturbed the water, and the effects were only now becoming visible. "That's weird," Marcus said, leaning closer to the pool edge. "It's like there's still something swimming down there." Morrison walked to the side of the pool and stared down into the chlorinated depth. The underwater lights cast their usual pale blue glow, but the water in lane 4 seemed somehow murkier, less transparent than it should be. "Walsh," Morrison called to his assistant coach, "when's the last time we had the filtration system checked?" 2 weeks ago, she replied, consulting her clipboard. Everything was normal. But normal was the last word anyone would use to describe what happened next. The lights above the pool began to flicker in a pattern, not the random electrical hiccups they'd been experiencing, but a deliberate rhythm that seemed almost like a code. The water in all the lanes started to move, creating a synchronized wave pattern that no one could explain. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The lights stabilized. The water returned to its normal post-practice calm. The only sound in the facility was the gentle hum of the filtration system and the distant traffic from the street outside. "Okay," Morrison said after a long moment of silence. "That's enough excitement for one night. Everyone get your gear and head home. We will figure out what's going on with the pool systems tomorrow." As the swimmers gathered their belongings, Dante lingered beside lane 4. Drawn by an inexplicable compulsion to understand what had happened to him in the water. The black line painted on the pool bottom looked the same as always, but something about it seemed different, as if it was somehow deeper, extending further into the water than physics should allow. "You coming, Dante?" Cassandra asked, her swim bag slung over her shoulder. "Yeah," he replied, but he didn't move. In a minute, one by one, his teammates left the facility, their voices echoing off the tile walls as they discussed plans for the weekend and speculated about the strange events they'd witnessed. Soon, only Dante and Coach Morrison remained in the pool area. "You sure you are okay, son?" Morrison asked, genuine concern replacing his usual gruff demeanor. Dante wanted to tell him about the sensation he'd experienced in the water, about the feeling that something had been swimming alongside him, matching his stroke for stroke. He wanted to explain how the pool had felt infinite and claustrophobic at the same time. how the water had seemed to whisper secrets in a language he almost understood. Instead, he said, "I'm fine, coach. Just a bad day, I guess." Morrison nodded, accepting the explanation because the alternative, that something genuinely unexplainable had occurred in his pool, was too disturbing to contemplate. "All right then, lock up behind yourself when you leave. And Dante?" Morrison paused at the door leading to the parking lot. "Don't let tonight get in your head. Champions aren't made by their best performances. They are made by how they respond to their worst." The heavy door closed behind Morrison with a sound like a tomb ceiling, leaving Dante alone in the vast, echoing space of the Clearwater Community Pool. The facility felt different when empty, as if the presence of other people had been masking something that was now free to reveal itself. The sounds of the filtration system seemed louder, more rhythmic, like some massive heart beating beneath the pool deck. The lights cast sharper shadows, and the empty lanes of water looked less like a place for athletic achievement and more like some ancient ritual space. Dante walked slowly around the perimeter of the pool, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. As he passed lane 4, he stopped, drawn once again to the spot where his race had gone so wrong. The water was perfectly still now, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights like a dark mirror. That's when he saw it. At the bottom of the pool, partially obscured by the lane line anchor, something metallic caught the light. It was small, probably no bigger than a coin, but it definitely didn't belong there. Pool maintenance was meticulous about removing foreign objects, and yet somehow this had been missed. Without thinking, Dante kicked off his shoes and dove into the pool fully clothed. The water felt normal now, just chlorinated pool water with the usual chemical bite. He swam down to the bottom and reached for the metallic object, his lungs beginning to burn from the depth and duration of the dive. His fingers closed around something cold and hard. As he pushed off the bottom and surfaced, he realized he was holding a small medallion on a broken chain. The metal was tarnished with age, and strange symbols were etched around the perimeter. In the center was a design he couldn't immediately identify, something that looked like a spiral, but with geometric patterns that seemed to move when he looked at them directly. Dante treaded water, studying the medallion in the harsh pool lighting. It felt old, not just neglected, but genuinely ancient, as if it had been waiting at the bottom of the pool for decades. The chain was broken in 2 places, suggesting it had been torn from someone's neck with considerable force. As he examined the mysterious object, Dante became aware that he was no longer alone in the facility. Footsteps echoed from somewhere in the building. Not the familiar sound of athletic shoes on tile, but something heavier, more deliberate. The steps seemed to be moving through the areas of the building that should have been locked after hours. The equipment storage, the office spaces, the maintenance areas that even the swimmers weren't supposed to access. Dante quickly swam to the edge of the pool and pulled himself out, the medallion clutched tightly in his fist. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence that replaced them was somehow more ominous than the sound had been. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the empty space. "Coach Morrison, is that you?" No response. Dante grabbed his shoes and quickly made his way toward the exit, every instinct telling him that he needed to leave immediately. As he reached the door, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze, the distinct splash of someone diving into the pool. He turned back to see expanding ripples in lane 4, exactly where he had been swimming moments before. But the pool area was empty. No one was in the water, and yet the evidence of entry was undeniable. Dante didn't wait to investigate further. He burst through the exit door into the October night, the medallion still clenched in his fist, and didn't stop running until he reached his car in the parking lot. As he drove away from Clearwater Community Pool, Dante glanced in his rearview mirror and saw something that would haunt him for the next 30 years. Every light in the facility was on, blazing against the dark October sky like some kind of beacon, and in the windows of the observation deck, the deck that was supposed to be locked and empty, a figure stood watching his departure. The figure raised one hand in what might have been a wave or a warning. October 16, 11:20. Temperature 48 foot. Heavy rain with intermittent fog. Dante Cornelius hadn't slept in 26 hours. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed in the cramped trailer he shared with his parents, the mysterious medallion rotating slowly between his fingers like a prayer wheel. The metal had grown warm from his touch, and in the dim light filtering through his window, the strange symbols seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Outside, the Oregon rain hammered against the aluminum siding with the persistence of a desperate visitor. His father's snores rattled through the paper-thin walls, occasionally punctuated by his mother's quiet coughing, a sound that had become the soundtrack to Dante's adolescence. The scholarship to UCLA wasn't just his dream anymore. It was his lifeline out of this slow-motion drowning. But first, he had to understand what he'd found at the bottom of Clearwater Pool. Dante had spent the previous day researching the symbols etched into the medallion, using the ancient computer at Riverside High's library. The geometric spiral design didn't match anything in the standard reference books, but something about it nagged at the edges of his memory like a half-remembered dream. It was while scrolling through archived newspaper articles about the community pool that he found the first piece of the puzzle. Local swimmer disappears during practice. Riverside Daily Chronicle, October. Riverside authorities are searching for Jeremy Blackwood, 16, who vanished during evening swim practice at the newly opened Clearwater Community Pool. Blackwood was last seen entering the pool for time trials at approximately 7. When coaches conducted a final head count 30 minutes later, the promising young athlete was nowhere to be found. "It's like he just vanished into thin air," said head coach William Garrison. "Jeremy was our strongest swimmer. He had college scouts interested." This doesn't make any sense. The Riverside Police Department is treating the disappearance as a potential drowning, though no body has been recovered. The pool has been drained and searched thoroughly. Anyone with information is asked to contact local authorities. Dante's hands trembled as he scrolled further through the digital archives. What he found made his blood turn to ice water. Second swimmer vanishes at Clearwater Pool. Riverside Daily Chronicle, October. In an eerie repeat of events from exactly 10 years ago, another teenage swimmer has disappeared from Clearwater Community Pool. Sandra Chen, 17, was last seen during evening practice on Tuesday. Like Jeremy Blackwood's disappearance in 1964, Chen vanished without leaving any trace. "The similarities are deeply disturbing," said Police Chief Robert Morrison. "Same date, same circumstances, same complete lack of evidence. We are reopening the investigation into both cases. The pool will be closed indefinitely pending a thorough investigation." Morrison. Dante's pulse quickened as he recognized the surname. Coach Morrison had never mentioned having a father in law enforcement, had never spoken about the pool's dark history. But then again, Coach Morrison rarely spoke about anything that didn't involve lap times and technique. Dante continued his search, his dread growing with each article he uncovered. Third swimmer disappears. Pool closed permanently. Riverside Daily Chronicle, October 5. Clearwater Community Pool will close permanently following the third unexplained disappearance of a teenage swimmer in 20 years. Marcus Torres, 16, vanished during practice on Monday evening, continuing a pattern that has baffled investigators for 2 decades. "We cannot in good conscience keep this facility open," said City Council President Helen Voss. 3 young lives lost is 3 too many. The pool will be filled with concrete and converted to a community center. However, funding issues have delayed the planned closure, and the pool remains operational under increased security measures. Voss, Dante's teammate Cassandra's mother, was on the city council, had been on the city council for years, according to local political coverage. Another connection that no one had ever mentioned. The pattern was undeniable. Every 10 years, on October 15th, a 16 or 17-year-old swimmer vanished from Clearwater Pool without a trace, and now it was 1994. Exactly 10 years since the last disappearance, Dante's phone rang, shattering the oppressive silence of his research. The display showed Cassandra's number. "Hello? Dante, thank God you answered." Cassandra's voice was tight with panic. "Something's wrong with the pool. I went back to get my goggles from my locker and you need to see this." "What do you mean something's wrong?" "The water. It's not normal. And there are people there. People who shouldn't be there." Dante looked at the medallion in his palm, its symbols seeming to pulse more rapidly now. "What kind of people?" "I don't know. They are wearing old-fashioned clothes, and they are just standing around the pool watching the water. When I tried to get closer, they looked at me, and their eyes..." She paused, her breathing uneven. "Dante, their eyes were completely black." "Cassandra, get out of there. Now." "I can't. My car won't start, and my phone is dying. Can you come get me?" Dante glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. Every instinct told him to stay away from Clearwater Pool, to call the police and let them handle whatever was happening. But Cassandra was his teammate, his friend, and she was in trouble. "I will be there in 15 minutes, he said. "Stay hidden, and don't go near the pool." "Dante?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I think they know I'm here." The line went dead. Dante grabbed his keys and ran for the door, pausing only to slip the medallion into his pocket. The rain had intensified, turning the trailer park's dirt roads into muddy rivers that threatened to swallow his battered Honda Civic. As he drove through the empty streets of Riverside, every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every streetlight revealed too little and concealed too much. Clearwater Community Pool sat in the center of a small park, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that had witnessed decades of the town's secrets. As Dante pulled into the parking lot, he could see that the building was dark except for the pale blue glow emanating from within. The underwater lights that should have been turned off hours ago. Cassandra's car was parked near the main entrance, its hood up and steam rising from the engine, but there was no sign of Cassandra herself. Dante approached the building cautiously, the medallion in his pocket growing warm against his leg. The main doors were locked, but he remembered the maintenance entrance that Coach Morrison sometimes used for equipment deliveries. It was hidden behind a cluster of overgrown shrubs on the building's east side. The maintenance door was not only unlocked, it was standing slightly ajar, as if someone had been expecting him. Inside, the facility was transformed. The harsh fluorescent lights had been replaced by the soft blue-green glow of the underwater illumination, casting everything in an otherworldly pallor that made familiar shapes look alien and threatening. The air itself felt different, thicker, charged with an energy that made the hair on Dante's arms stand on end. And around the pool, exactly as Cassandra had described, stood figures in clothing from another era. There were 5 of them, spaced evenly around the pool's perimeter like points on a pentagram. They wore swimwear from different decades. A woman in a 1940s one-piece, a man in 1960s swim trunks, a teenager in 1970s racing gear. All of them faced the water with perfect stillness, their attention focused on something beneath the surface. Dante recognized them from the newspaper archives. Jeremy Blackwood, missing since 1964, stood at the head of Lane 4 in his vintage racing suit. Sandra Chen, gone since 1974, wore a team warm-up jacket over her swimsuit. Marcus Torres, disappeared in 1984, had a towel draped around his shoulders as if he'd just finished practice. But it was the 4th figure that made Dante's breath catch in his throat. A teenage girl with short blonde hair stood beside the diving board, her body language radiating the same focused intensity that Dante recognized in his teammate. She wore a Riverside Riptides team suit identical to Cassandra's, but the style was slightly off, older, from perhaps the early 90s. This wasn't Cassandra. This was someone else. Someone who had disappeared before the pattern that Dante had discovered in the newspaper archives. Someone whose disappearance had never been reported, never investigated, never solved. The fifth figure stood at the pool's deep end, dressed in the coaching attire of the night. Dante didn't recognize him, but something about his posture and the way he held himself suggested authority, responsibility, guilt. As Dante watched, transfixed by the impossible scene before him, the figures began to move. Not walking, exactly, but gliding across the pool deck with fluid motions that defied physics. They converged on lane 4, the same lane where Dante had experienced his mysterious encounter the previous evening. The water in the pool began to glow more brightly, and Dante could see shapes moving beneath the surface. Not fish or debris, but human forms swimming in perfect synchronization, their movements creating patterns that matched the symbols on the medallion in his pocket. That's when he heard Cassandra's voice. "Dante, is that you?" She emerged from behind the pool equipment storage area, her team warm-up suit soaked and her hair plastered to her head. Despite the fact that the pool deck appeared dry, her eyes, when she looked at him, held an expression he'd never seen before. Ancient, knowing, sad beyond her 17 years. "Cassandra, we need to leave. Now." Dante started toward her, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I can't leave, Dante. Not anymore." "What do you mean you can't leave?" She gestured toward the figures around the pool, who had now turned their attention to Dante. Up close, he could see that Cassandra had been right. Their eyes were completely black, like deep water at night. "They have been waiting," Cassandra said. "Every 10 years, someone has to join them. Someone has to keep the pattern going. It was supposed to be you." "What are you talking about?" "October 15th, 1994. Your time, Dante. That's why the water felt different yesterday. That's why you found the medallion. It was calling to you." Dante's hand instinctively moved to his pocket, where the medallion had grown almost too hot to touch. "This is insane. We are leaving. Both of us." But when he looked back at Cassandra, she was no longer standing on the pool deck. She was in the water, floating on her back in lane 4, with her eyes closed and a peaceful expression on her face. The other figures had formed a circle around her, their black eyes reflecting the underwater lights like mirrors. "Cassandra." Dante dove toward the pool, but as his hands broke the surface, the water felt like liquid ice. The cold shot through his body with such intensity that his muscles seized, and he found himself sinking toward the bottom of the deep end. Through the burning chlorine haze, he could see the truth that had been hidden beneath Clearwater Pool for decades. The bottom wasn't concrete and tile. It was a vast opening that extended down into darkness beyond the reach of any light, and rising from that darkness were dozens of figures. Every swimmer who had ever vanished, every coach who had covered up the disappearances, every official who had allowed the pattern to continue. They were all there, preserved in the cold water, waiting for the cycle to complete itself. Dante kicked frantically toward the surface, his lungs burning with the need for air. But the water seemed to stretch infinitely upward, and the pool lights grew dimmer and more distant with each passing second. Just as consciousness began to fade, strong hands grabbed him under the arms and pulled him from the water. "Breathe, son. Come on, breathe." Coach Morrison's face swam into focus above him, creased with worry and something that looked like guilt. Dante was lying on the pool deck, coughing up chlorinated water and shivering uncontrollably. "Where's Cassandra?" Dante gasped. Morrison's expression darkened. "What are you talking about?" "Cassandra's at home. Has been all evening." Dante struggled to sit up, his vision clearing enough to see that the pool area looked normal again. The underwater lights were off, the mysterious figures were gone, and the water was perfectly still. Only the lingering scent of ozone and something else, something old and organic, suggested that anything unusual had occurred. "She called me," Dante insisted. "She was here, in the water." "Son, you have been hallucinating. Hypothermia can do that." Morrison helped him to his feet. "I got a call from building security about someone breaking in. Found you unconscious in the pool." But as Morrison led him toward the exit, Dante noticed something that made his blood freeze again. Floating in lane 4, barely visible in the dim emergency lighting, was a Riverside Riptide swim cap. Cassandra's swim cap. "Coach," Dante said, his voice barely a whisper. "You need to call Cassandra's parents. Make sure she's okay." Morrison's step hesitated for just a moment. "Why would I need to do that?" "Because I think something terrible is about to happen. And I think you know what it is." Morrison stopped walking and turned to face Dante, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "What makes you think that?" Dante pulled the medallion from his pocket. In the dim light, its symbols seemed to writhe like living things. "Because this belonged to someone who disappeared here 30 years ago. And because your father was the police chief who covered it up." For a long moment, Morrison stared at the medallion without speaking. When he finally looked up at Dante, his eyes held the weight of decades of buried secrets. "You don't understand what you are dealing with, son." "Then explain it to me." Morrison glanced around the empty facility, as if checking to make sure they were truly alone. "Some things are bigger than individual lives. Some patterns can't be broken without destroying everything around them." "What kind of pattern?" "The kind that keeps something much worse from happening." Morrison's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The pool wasn't built here by accident, Dante. This spot, it's been sacred ground for 1,000 years. The local tribes knew never to disturb it, but when the white settlers came, they didn't listen to the warnings." "What's down there? What did I see at the bottom of the pool?" "A doorway. And every 10 years, it tries to open wider. The only thing that keeps it closed is a sacrifice. Someone young, strong, full of life and dreams." Dante felt the medallion burning against his palm. "And it was supposed to be me." Morrison nodded reluctantly. "The medallion chooses. It's been choosing for decades. But something went wrong this time. The water rejected you. Because Cassandra took my place." "No." Morrison's voice was barely audible. "Because Cassandra was never supposed to be the sacrifice. She was supposed to be the guardian." Before Dante could ask what that meant, the lights in the facility went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the silence that followed, they could hear the sound of water moving, not the gentle lapping of waves, but the purposeful movement of something large and powerful. Something that had been sleeping at the bottom of Clearwater Pool for 30 years. And now it was waking up. October 16, 12/7. Temperature, 45 Biloft. Storm intensified. In the absolute darkness of Clearwater Community Pool, Dante Cornelius felt the medallion in his hand pulse with a rhythm that matched his terrified heartbeat. The sound of water moving grew louder, more deliberate, as if something massive was rising from the depths below. "Morrison," Dante whispered, "what did you mean Cassandra was supposed to be the guardian?" Coach Morrison's breathing was labored in the darkness beside him. "Every cycle needs two elements to maintain the balance. The sacrifice feeds the entity below, keeps it dormant. But the guardian keeps the doorway sealed from this side." A low rumble shook the building, and the emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in hellish red. The pool water was no longer still. It was churning as if something enormous was stirring in its depths. "The Voss family has been guardians for 4 generations," Morrison continued, his voice thick with decades of buried guilt. "Helen Voss's great-grandmother was the first. She made a pact with the entity in 1894, after it had consumed half the original settlement. Every 10 years, 1 life in exchange for 10 years of peace. And Cassandra doesn't know. She was supposed to learn on her 18th birthday. But something's gone wrong. The entity is waking up early, and without the proper sacrifice." Morrison's words were cut off by a sound that would haunt Dante for the rest of his life. A voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, speaking in harmonics that human vocal cords could never produce. "The covenant is broken," the voice said, and with it came the scent of deep water and decay. "The chosen one rejected the call. The guardian line has been severed. The long sleep ends now. The pool water began to glow with phosphorescent light, and Dante could see shapes moving beneath the surface. Not the peaceful swimmers he had witnessed earlier, but writhing forms that defied anatomical logic. Tentacles the size of telephone poles undulated just below the waterline, and something that might once have been eyes reflected the emergency lighting like wet stones. "We need to get out of here," Dante said, but Morrison grabbed his arm. "There's nowhere to run. It's been feeding on this town for over a century. If it fully awakens, everyone within 50 miles will be consumed. Then what do we do?" Morrison's face was grim in the red emergency lighting. "We complete the ritual. Someone has to take Cassandra's place as guardian, and someone has to willingly enter the water as sacrifice." "You are insane if you think I'm going to..." "Dante." Cassandra's voice echoed from somewhere above them. They looked up to see her standing on the observation deck. The same deck that was supposed to be locked, the same place where Dante had seen the mysterious figure watching him the night before. But this wasn't the Cassandra he knew. Her skin had taken on a pale, translucent quality, and her eyes held depths that seemed to contain centuries rather than 17 years. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated with the entity below. "I can see it all now," she said. "Every cycle, every sacrifice, every family that's been complicit in maintaining the lie. The Morrisons training the swimmers, the Voss family providing the guardians, the police covering up the disappearances, the city council ensuring the pool never gets permanently closed. Cassandra, you need to come down from there." Morrison called up to her. "Do I? Or do I need to finally break this obscene cycle?" The water in the pool began to rise, defying physics as it climbed higher than the pool's edge, and began to spread across the deck. Within the supernatural flood, Dante could see the ghostly forms of every swimmer who had vanished over the past 30 years, their eyes now glowing with the same phosphorescent light as the entity below. "The truth is," Cassandra continued, her voice growing stronger, "my family never volunteered to be guardians. We were enslaved to this role. Generation after generation of Voss women sacrificing their lives to maintain a balance that benefits no one but the creature below." Morrison stepped forward, water now lapping at his ankles. "Cassandra, without the guardians, that thing will consume everything. The sacrifices were necessary to protect the town." "Protect the town, or protect the secret?" Cassandra's laugh was bitter and carried echoes of her grandmother's voice, and her great-grandmother's before that. "I have seen the memories now, Morrison. I know what really happened in..." The entity below let out a sound like whales singing in reverse, and the building shook so violently that chunks of concrete began falling from the ceiling. Dante clutched the medallion, which was now burning hot enough to sear his palm. "What happened in 1894? He shouted over the growing chaos. "The original settlers didn't just stumble onto sacred ground," Cassandra called down. "They were led here by Morrison's great-great-grandfather and mine. They made a deal with the entity. It would make them wealthy beyond imagination, give them control over the growing town, in exchange for regular feeding." "That's not true," Morrison protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it? How else would you explain how the Morrison family has held positions of authority in this community for 4 generations? How else would you explain why the Voss family has always been on the city council? We weren't protecting the town from the entity. We were feeding the town to it, one teenager at a time." The water on the pool deck was now knee-deep, and continuing to rise. The ghostly swimmers moved through it like sharks, their forms becoming more solid and threatening with each passing moment. Dante realized that if he didn't act soon, the rising water would trap them all. "The medallion," he shouted to Cassandra. "What does it really do?" "It's a key," she replied. "Not just to choose the sacrifice, but to open or close the doorway permanently. My ancestor used it to create the original covenant, but it can also be used to sever the connection forever." "Then do it." It requires a blood sacrifice from both family lines, a Morrison and a Voss, willingly given. Morrison's face went white. No, absolutely not. If we break the covenant without sealing the doorway properly, thing will be free to roam wherever it wants. The entire Pacific Northwest could be at risk, and if we don't break it, Cassandra countered, it continues forever. More children die, more families are destroyed, and the entity grows stronger with each feeding. The water was now waist deep, and the temperature in the building had dropped so dramatically that Dante could see his breath. The entity below was rising, its massive form creating currents that threatened to knock them off their feet. There's a third option, Dante said suddenly, the knowledge coming to him as if whispered by the medallion itself. What if we redirect the covenant? Instead of feeding it teenagers, we feed it the families who created this situation in the first place. Morrison spun to face him. What are you talking about? The entity doesn't care who it consumes, as long as it gets life force. What if we offer it the accumulated guilt and power of everyone who's been complicit in maintaining this cycle? Every Morrison who trained swimmers knowing they might die, every Voss who served as guardian while children vanished, every official who covered up the disappearances. That's dozens of people, Morrison whispered. People who chose to perpetuate a system that killed innocent teenagers. Dante replied. People who valued their own power and position over the lives of children. Cassandra was silent for a long moment, and Dante could see her processing the implications. The ghostly swimmers in the water around them seemed to be listening as well, their glowing eyes fixed on the conversation. It could work, she said finally, but it would require both of us to enter the water willingly, to make the offering together, and there's no guarantee we'd survive the process. Better than letting this continue for another century, Dante said. The entity below seemed to sense the shift in the conversation, and its movements became more agitated. The water began to spin in a massive whirlpool around the pool's center, and the building's lights flickered ominously. It's now or never, Cassandra said, and before anyone could stop her, she dove from the observation deck into the churning water below. Dante didn't hesitate. He clutched the medallion tightly and jumped into the supernatural flood. The water was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Not just cold, but actively hostile to human life. It felt like swimming through liquid nitrogen mixed with the concentrated essence of every nightmare he'd ever had. The medallion in his hand pulsed with increasing intensity, and he could feel it drawing power from both his life force and Cassandra's. Through the phosphorescent glow, he could see the entity in its full, horrible glory. It was massive beyond comprehension, a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes and mouths that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human perception could process. But it was also ancient and tired, sustained only by the regular feeding that had kept it dormant for decades at a time. Cassandra appeared beside him in the water, her form flickering between her normal appearance and something far older and more powerful. Together they pressed their bleeding palms against the medallion, and Dante felt their combined will focus into a single, overwhelming intention. Instead of offering themselves as sacrifice, they offered the entity something far more substantial, the accumulated guilt and complicity of 4 generations of families who had maintained the covenant. Every Morrison who had trained swimmers while knowing the truth, every Voss who had served as guardian while children died, every official who had covered up disappearances, every city council member who had prevented the pool's closure. The entity's response was immediate and terrible. It accepted the offering with an eagerness that shook the building to its foundations. Through the water, Dante could feel the life force of dozens of people across Riverside being drawn into the creature's massive form. But instead of growing stronger, the entity began to change. The concentrated guilt and corruption it was consuming was poisonous to it, like trying to sustain itself on toxic waste instead of pure life force. Its massive form began to convulse, and the water around them turned black with what might have been blood or might have been something far worse. The ghostly swimmers throughout the pool began to glow more brightly, and Dante realized they weren't trapped spirits. They were the entity's previous victims, held in a state between life and death to serve as its guardians. As the creature weakened, they began to break free of its influence. Jeremy Blackwood, missing since 1964, swam toward them with purpose rather than malevolence. Sandra Chen and Marcus Torres followed, along with dozens of other swimmers whose disappearances had never been reported or investigated. They formed a circle around Dante and Cassandra. Their combined will focused on a single goal: ending the cycle forever. The entity let out a sound like reality tearing, and suddenly Dante found himself standing on solid ground. The pool was empty, its concrete bottom cracked and scarred, but no longer hiding an interdimensional doorway. The ghostly swimmers were gone, finally at peace, and scattered around the facility were the bodies of everyone who had been complicit in maintaining the covenant: Coach Morrison, city council members, police officials, all dead from apparent heart attacks that had occurred simultaneously. Cassandra stood beside him, no longer translucent but solid and human again. The medallion in Dante's hand had turned to dust, its purpose finally fulfilled. "Is it over?" she asked. Dante looked around the destroyed facility, then down at the crack in the pool bottom, where something ancient and malevolent had once dwelt. The crack was sealing itself, reality knitting back together as if the doorway had never existed. "It's over," he said. But even as he spoke the words, Dante couldn't shake the feeling that they had only solved one piece of a much larger puzzle. How many other towns had similar secrets? How many other families had made similar pacts with entities that fed on human suffering? As they walked out of Clearwater Community Pool for the last time, Dante noticed that his watch had stopped at exactly 12:17 a.m., the moment when everything had changed. Outside, the storm was breaking, and the first hints of dawn were beginning to show on the eastern horizon. The official investigation into the multiple deaths would rule them all as coincidental heart attacks brought on by stress and underlying health conditions. The pool would be permanently closed and filled with concrete, just as it should have been decades earlier, and the families of the swimmers who had vanished over the years would finally have closure, though they would never know the true circumstances of their children's disappearances. Dante and Cassandra never spoke publicly about what had happened that night. They both left Riverside after graduation, Dante to UCLA on his swimming scholarship, Cassandra to study anthropology at Portland State, drawn by a need to understand the historical patterns that had nearly destroyed their hometown. But sometimes, late at night, they would call each other and discuss the dreams they both still had. Dreams of deep water and ancient hungers, of other towns with other secrets, of entities that had learned to adapt to the modern world in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. Because the truth was, Clearwater Pool had only been one node in a much larger network, and somewhere out there, in communities across the country, other families were maintaining other covenants with other horrors, all in the name of power and prosperity. The cycle in Riverside was broken, but the war against the darkness that fed on human innocence was far from over. October 15, 6:47 p.m. Dr. Cassandra Voss Hartwell stood in the empty lot where Clearwater Community Pool had once stood, a stack of manila folders clutched in her hands. After 3 decades of research into ritualistic disappearances across the Pacific Northwest, she had finally assembled enough evidence to understand the true scope of what they had uncovered as teenagers. Beside her, Dante Cornelius, now a successful swim coach at the University of Oregon, studied the architectural plans for the new community center that would soon break ground on this site. 17 similar cases, Cassandra said, opening the top folder. 17 communities with pools or swimming facilities built on sites that local indigenous populations considered taboo, all with patterns of disappearances occurring in 10-year cycles. "How many are still active?" Dante asked. "Based on recent missing persons reports, at least 8. She handed him a photograph of a teenage girl who had vanished from a pool in Eugene just 2 months earlier. Jennifer Martinez, 16, disappeared during evening practice. No body found, no evidence of foul play. Dante studied the photo, seeing echoes of his younger self in the girl's determined expression. What do? We do what we should have done 30 years ago. Cassandra replied. We warn people, we investigate, we break every covenant we can find, and the ones we can't break. Cassandra looked up at the overcast October sky, where the first drops of the season's rain were beginning to fall. Then we make sure that what happened to us, what we survived, doesn't happen to anyone else. As they walked away from the empty lot, neither of them noticed the small crack that had appeared in the concrete foundation that had been poured over the original pool site. It was barely visible, no wider than a pencil line, but deep enough to suggest that some doorways, once opened, could never be completely sealed. And in that crack, something that had been waiting patiently for 30 years stirred slightly, testing the boundaries of its prison. The cycle in Riverside was broken, but cycles, like water, have a way of finding new paths when the old ones are blocked.